Hello everyone, welcome back to the course of Introductions to General Linguistics. And previously you have already learned about the branches in linguistics such as semantics and then phonetics phonology as well as morphology. That these three branches are classified in microlinguistics. Today we are going to discuss more on branches in macrolinguistics. So the objective of this study is that in the end of the sessions, you're going to be familiar with some concepts and also terminology regarding to branches of linguistics in macrolinguistics such as psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, stylistics, discourse analysis, and many more. So let's begin with psycholinguistics. Psycholinguistics is the study of how language is acquired. That means it is related to the language processing in our brains. So basically the term psycholinguistics derive from two terms. The first one is psycho and the second one is linguistic. When we talk about the first one, it's related to the mental process. The mental process in this context is about the discussions about what is the definitions about short-term memory, and then long-term memory, encoding, retrievals, mental representations, and many more. Now, when we talk about linguistics in correlation to psycholinguistics, it will be related to how aspect of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and other rules are acquired by humans. In psycholinguistics, there are several terminology that you should be familiar with. Number one is language acquisitions. Language acquisitions in this context is the process of acquiring new language or your first language. For example, when you live in Indonesia, your first language may be Indonesian. Or some of you that lives in, for example, rural area, that maybe your first language is your mother language that's related to local language. For example, you're born as a Javanese, then your first language is Javanese, and then you're born in Lampung community, then your first language is Lampungese. Alright, in this term you're going to be familiar with some theories. And the theories number one is the innate hypothesis by Noam Chomsky. So Chomsky explained that children actually acquire a language since they are born, and the language acquisition will come naturally. In this context, in this innate hypothesis, it means that human actually has the aspects in their brains in terms of how human itself has the capability to develop the language itself. So that's what is innate hypothesis all about. Alright, as opposed to the innate hypothesis, we also have another hypothesis that is called as critical period hypothesis that is proposed by Penfield and also Roberts. Penfield and also Roberts claim that there is a period of time when a kid grows and language can be acquired at fast. So the critical period means that there is specific periods, like from the baby were born until 5 years old. There will be, let's say, a time when children acquire language as many as possible that depends on the inputs around them. So that's the difference whether it is innate that children has or a baby has capability to process the language, or it is actually there should be certain periods where the language can be acquired at best. So in this context, you should be also familiar with L2. L2 means that the language that you acquire after your mother language or your first language. For example, you're going to schools, then you learn Indonesian language, then your L2 is Indonesian. So I hope that you're familiar with the context of L1 and L2 as well as language acquisitions. Different from language acquisitions, we also have the terms that is language learning. Language learning in this context is that the language that you learn after the first language. In this context is that when you go to school and then learn Indonesian language, and then for example you also learn Indonesian language or English language later in certain settings where the setting is like a lesson and you intentionally learn this, so it is not come naturally. So that's what we call as language learning. The third big terminology that you should be familiar with is language processing. It is actually the process of the speech productions until the interpretations. So in this context, the productions goes as follows. For example, someone speak up a certain sentence or in a certain conversations. Then there is a, let's say, a speech productions, and then in that speech productions there will be like selections of words, and then how your brains try to process grammatical organizations, and then you try to articulate that one. So and then you use the vocal organs, and then the sounds are heard. So that's language processing from the speech productions, from the selections until the productions itself is based on the leveled models and also the Delft models. So that's actually speech productions. Now, second of all is that the language comprehension itself. Language comprehensions consists of the inputs that you have got from someone that produces a language, and then try to process that inputs using your brains, and then you try to break down the rules syntactically, semantically, and other grammatical functions, and after that you try to get the interpretations about what you have already heard from that inputs. Now, in this context, be familiar also with the context of language performance. This is how humans use the language. So it's based on the productions of language in human communications. So in conclusion, psycholinguistics is not the study of linguistics that stand alone, but it is actually interdisciplinary, because you talk about other parts of linguistic subject. It's not merely about syntax, but it's also in relations to semantics, phonetic and phonology. Even it's also now it's related to the neuropsychology, and it's related to the anthropology, and also related to computer science. So it's like a broad terms and interactions of one science to another science. All right. So after we discuss about psycholinguistics, we discuss about what we call as sociolinguistics. All right. Sociolinguistics is the study of language in relation to the social aspects. The social aspects in this context is that it's related to how the language used by particular society. So in the context of sociolinguistics, you should be familiar with what we call as social domain. Social domain in this context are, it can be ethnicity, it can be about the religions, it can be about the status, gender, level of education, age, and etc. And why this study is important is because there are certain variations of language that is produced by that different social domains or social backgrounds. Now let's learn about the basic terminology in sociolinguistics. Number one is isolex. Isolex is the dialects that's produced by someone as an individual. So bigger than idiolects, we have sociolects, which is the variety or language variations based on specific social domains. It can be like the sociolects of Muslim community, the sociolects of people living in a particular area, or sociolects of businessmen, for example, and etc. All right, now let's talk about the speech communities. Speech communities are groups of peoples of any social class, students or workers, even friends and family. So actually the use of the language in that speech community is based on the shared norm or similar norms that shows the specific characteristic of language, such as the pronunciations, grammars, and also vocabulary. So usually speech communities will have certain types of varieties again. That is called as high prestige and a low prestige. So prestige in this context is defined as something related to the type of the social accent they used. For example, we have the term high prestige that is associated with the language of the upper class, and we also have the low prestige that is associated with the language or intellect of the lower classes. So people basically involved in many kinds of networks or communities. So that is why we divide it into two. The first one is tight community, when you try to interact to each other like a more intimate. Meanwhile, we also have the terms like a looser community, when you only have little interactions amongst the member groups. So that's actually basically the tight community versus looser community. So when language are spoken, we cannot deny that there will be significant changes of that language that can be influenced by many things. For example, like technology, migrations, and then political stability, and etc. So now moving on to the terms of language change. So a language change is actually the change that we can see in our community that can be traced historically. So we can see this term as the diachronic change. For example, that you can differentiate the terms or some words in Old English and then move to Middle English and now move to the Modern English, or even now you have specific vocabulary in World Englishes. So when we talk about language change, it's not only talk about the sociolinguistic aspect itself, but we can also try to talk about the smaller units of linguistics that we can observe. For example, it is the change in the phonological aspects, or maybe syntactical aspects, and semantic aspects, and other features that can be observed over time. But these phenomena should be seen diachronically and cannot be observed just in particular time. Alright, so one last term you should be familiar in social linguistics is that there is a term, so what we call as language contact. So language contact is that when there are some languages that come together, then society will try to use that, then there will be influence to one of them or influence to one another. So the most common way that language influence each other is that the exchange of words. For example, we have words like sushi, the Japanese word that now already familiar that everybody in this world refer to that kind of food is sushi. That is because there is a lexical gap in the language that certain people speak. So like there will be like borrowing and etc. Alright, so it's also the terminology that you should be familiar is that sometimes it happens into the more prestigious language. So we consider that language more prestigious, then we take that vocabulary and then insert it in our language, then use it in daily communications. Alright, so this is the end of the first two discussions about macrolinguistics. We talk about psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics. So thank you very much. See you in another video.